Good morning. Welcome to the first Resource Center for Public Sociology workshop of this academic year. I'm Ann Kim, a faculty member in sociology and current director of the center. I'd like to begin by recognizing that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the Resource Center for Public Sociology, the Department of Sociology, and York University. The RCPS acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Although this workshop lies in virtual space, we are supported by an institutional space that benefited from colonization, and perhaps we can take a moment at some point in our day today to reflect on this along with the physical space that we ourselves occupy. For this reason, and for the recent and ongoing events that challenge taken for granted beliefs that we have achieved universal civil rights and racial equity, particularly for Black and Indigenous peoples across Canada, we are focusing this year's workshops and events around the interrelated themes of racial equity, decolonizing knowledges, and research ethics. This country's official discourse as a multicultural nation belies the entrenched systemic and institutionalized Eurocentric ideology that persists in education, the justice system, labor markets and the economy, healthcare, research, and that structures our day-to-day lives and interactions. Public sociology has an important role to play in mapping such inequities and in confronting dominant ideas, assumptions, and practices in scholarship and in everyday lives. With this aim, this year's RCPS workshops join broader dialogues and calls to action. For those of you new to RCPS, we are the Resource Center for Public Sociology, and we belong to the Department of Sociology at York University. Our core objectives are to promote and advance public sociological research which maps power and inequality, to develop innovative approaches for communicating research to publics, and to promote methods of public sociology in teaching and research. We are staffed by a longtime administrator, Sue Foster, and advised by a committee of sociology faculty and students. Before I turn to my colleague, Professor Eric Mikolovsky, who will introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Sylvia Grills, I'd like to first announce our next event on the principles of conducting research in Jane Finch by the Jane Finch Community Research Partnership. It will be held October 22nd at 11:30. Please email us at socrcps@yorku.ca to get on our listserv. That's socrcps@yorku.ca. Also, you should know for the first time in the history of the department, this event is live streaming on YouTube and being recorded on YouTube and Zoom. I feel like we've covered all our bases. A positive consequence out of COVID-19 is that we have been forced kicking and screaming to joining the 21st century. Another positive consequence is that we are not subjecting our guests to the lingering scent of pizza in our RCPS seminar room. So our plan for today's event is that Dr. Grills will speak for about an hour, and we will follow their presentation by taking questions via the chat function in Zoom, and crossing fingers if we can manage it via the comments section in YouTube. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mikolovsky.
Thanks so much, Anne. And for those of you, it's nice to see everyone. For those of you who've not been to the physical side of the RCPS, the reason it smells of pizza is that is it a pizza that's sort of next door. So the wafts of pizza sort of float through the air and delight us when we're in the RCPS. So I'm absolutely so happy to introduce Sylvia Grills to all of you today. I first met Sylvia in 2000 for the study held in New York City that year, well before our current COVID-19 context. And Sylvia was a speaker in a panel on new perspectives on activism and political participation. And Sylvia gave a talk. You know, sometimes you go to these panels and there's one talk that really just kind of like is a flashpoint, or people really gravitate toward it. And not to diminish the other participants in the panel, Sylvia's talk, for me at least, was that moment and generated a lot of discussion at the meetings. And I immediately fairly immediately approached Sylvia and asked them whether they would be interested in speaking about their work to our program. And so I'm delighted that that is happening today. By way of a more formal introduction, Dr. Grills obtained their PhD from the Department of Sociology at Queen's University in 2020. Their areas of interest include social inequality studies, anti-racism theory, material feminisms, art-based methods, and pedagogy. Dr. Grills completed a portfolio dissertation about their anti-racism research in Toronto. As part of the dissertation, they wrote and produced a stage production entitled We Without You that engages with different modes of community participation and how this participation is shaped by race. Their dissertation contributes to how we understand anti-racism, allyship, and community coalitions. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Sylvia. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for bringing up the conference in New York. That was a really great experience, and it's feels like a really long time ago, but it wasn't. Our context of doing work and engaging in virtual spaces has changed quite a bit. But I'm really, really happy to be here today. I do like the digital format, even though it's different and it's a lot to learn. Hopefully it makes it more accessible for more people. The title of my talk is, Does Everyone Want to be an Anti-Racism Ally? Solidarity in Public Sociology. So before I really get into that, I want to give a brief overview. First, I'm going to talk about my dissertation research just a little bit, because some of what I want to discuss is based in that research. And as was mentioned, it's about queer anti-racism in a Toronto context. But today I'll mainly be talking about, or a little bit about, how self-identified white participants spoke about being anti-racism allies. I'll talk a little bit about current context of anti-racism that we may or may not be familiar with. I'm going to talk about what an ally is and some of the barriers to allyship. And then I'll transition a little bit to talk about committing to solidarity and public sociology and performance as public sociology. So in response to the current political moment, and at the time that I did the proposal for my dissertation, that moment was marked by the shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Black Lives Matter protesting the 2016 Pride Parade, the election of Donald Trump. And particularly after the election, we are very much affected by American politics in Canada. I kind of had the feeling that things might get a lot worse for many ways for many people. And I wanted to know more about how people experience queer and racial intersections in Toronto. I think in many ways, Canadians and others look to Toronto as kind of a way to measure what's going on in the world. And I wanted to see how coalitions, anti-racism coalitions and anti-colonial coalitions might be forming, and kind of how different communities were coming together to address the political moment of our times. So in 2017, I lived in Toronto for 6 months in order to observe and document intersections centered on race, ethnicity, and queerness. I interviewed 17 people who self-identify as part of who self-identify as queer in some ways. There are many, many ways to do that. I engaged in content analysis of advertising and media coverage, and I engaged in participant observation at events such as the Pride Parade, the 519 Green Space Festival. I was at the community meeting about missing people from the Gay Village area. where we talked about the serial killer who was active at the time. I walked around neighborhoods such as Queens West for hours and hours and hours. I spent months building a physical presence in these neighborhoods, talking to people, kind of watching the interactions that people were having. I saw the posters for that community meeting that I mentioned that were vandalized to recenter gay men as victims of violence, despite that meeting being meant to address community safety for everyone. I saw police interactions that centered on victim blaming and a lack of support for community concerns. All of this to say, I learned so much about queer and racial intersections during my fieldwork for my PhD. And I used a queer anti-racism theoretical framework to interpret my data. So some of the current context of anti-racism that we might be familiar with. Currently, there are a lot of protests against police violence. There's a lot of activity in Black Lives Matter and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls movements. And these receive differing levels of media coverage, but it's important to remember that racism is a much larger issue. Racism is related to precarious housing and precarious employment. It's related to healthcare, food production, climate change, sports and entertainment. Racism really is embedded in our social and institutional structures. And it's important to note that racism, colonialism, and other forms of oppression are not the same, but they are related. These issues are intersectional, and they're very much connected to our social outcomes and material outcomes. And even though Canadians, people who watch the news, people who look out in the street tend to have the most exposure to sensationalized moments or attention generating public events, such as protests or statues coming down or any kind of violence related to protests or violence related to pride. It's important to remember that although these sensationalized moments, these popularized moments can be very effective at bringing people together, increasing awareness, providing support, encouraging change, these moments do not always show all the hard work that is needed before and after these events in order to produce structural change. Protests are often supported with research, medical support, knowledge of institutional structures, and they largely happen because people got organized and stayed organized. And when people are acting on principles of anti-racism, it's important that they listen to community organizers and leaders who have experience, because they usually know what works and they know what to ask for if they ever have the opportunity to ask for something from governments and institutions. So if you are currently in the position where you think of yourself as an ally, or you're just starting a journey of acting on principles of anti-racism, that's great. I really hope my presentation can help you. I want to give everyone a few things to think about when considering their relationship to anti-racism. And I'm going to discuss public sociology as a method that enables us as scholars to commit to solidarity. Something to think about as I move through my presentation is how can people who are interested in being allies or acting on anti-racism commit to solidarity through and beyond sensationalized moments. So what is an ally? What does it mean to be an ally? Does allyship require education? Can one self-identify as an ally? Do personal relationships with marginalized people qualify as allyship? There's some competing definitions about what an ally is and what it means to act as an ally, but some main themes emerge in scholarly work, such as constant and consistent action, prioritizing a structural understanding of privilege and oppression, accountable self-reflection, vocal support for marginalized people, and listening to others. However, in practice, allyship does not always look like people doing any of these things. For example, people in my study, the people that I spoke with for my research, Many of the self-identified white people said that they were anti-racism allies, but that they faced significant barriers that prevented them from acting as an ally and prevented them from being informed about racism. So some of these barriers that we discussed in interviews all kind of centered around common themes. And the first is that self-identified white people who participated in my research didn't see themselves in anti-racism. So what do I mean by that? They didn't think there was a place for them in anti-racism work, and they couldn't think of other white people who were doing this work. They weren't sure how to take action or what actions to take. And they weren't always sure about what the issues are. For example, some white participants were not informed about how race shapes interactions with police. And also, self-identified white participants said that they didn't want to upset people by speaking about issues that white people shouldn't speak about. And this is really important because the idea of social and professional risk and discomfort really was a main barrier to being anti-racist or acting on principles of anti-racism. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking these barriers because it's important to understand the things that we might have to deal with if we want to act on anti-racism, not only from ourselves, but also from others. So the first here is preoccupations with the self. So being concerned with how others view us or how we might view ourselves. And sort of Estava says that preoccupations with the self and morality can really redirect and prevent anti-racism, either because we get defensive when we have our moral identity challenged, or we recognize our own participation in racism and oppression. And both of these things can provoke a strong emotional response. And in this moment, we might think of that as white fragility. So anger, fear, tears, generally being upset when our perceptions of ourselves are challenged. But also an important thing to note here is bad faith arguments or bad faith engagements. And this can include gaslighting, tone policing, or asking someone to defend a misrepresentation or an inflammatory version of their argument. The current president of the United States, Donald Trump, recently said that teaching critical race theory is un-American. And I think that's a really good example of a bad faith argument. And it's an indication of just how important critical conversations about racism and white supremacy are in this political moment. So D'Angelo notes that engaging in anti-racism, when we think about how we have contributed to racism or how we fit into racist structures, this is likely going to be uncomfortable, but that's work and it's important work. So just a little bit more about white fragility here. White fragility refers to a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, and it triggers a range of defensive moves, such as those displays of emotions that I mentioned, fear and guilt, argumentation, silence, and even leaving the stress-inducing situation. Which brings me to the role of emotional regulation. So committing to anti-racism can put people at work, can put people at risk. We could upset people, allies or people committing to solidarity might lose relationships, might incur economic insecurity. They might no longer view their relationships as safe and supportive. And emotional regulation really does shape community engagement. So as Ahmed says, the emotions of people who are upset, which can include racialized others, people engaging in anti-racism, become a threat to the happiness of the group or the idea of happiness for the group because of their upsettedness. And these emotions are often reframed to center the emotions and comfort of white people or other people in positions of authority or power, which produces community exclusion for those deemed improperly emotional. And emotional responses from those who are made uncomfortable by anti-racism and or their participation in racism can detract from anti-racism and structural change by directing people to focus on that emotional response and providing care or comfort, or again, recentering the comfort of the upset person. Consider that being able to disengage from anti-racism is a form of privilege. Many people cannot step away from anti-racism or racism because of their embodiment or their experiences, or they just really dislike living in a world where racist things happen. White people do not face the same risks or the same level of risk as people of color when engaging in anti-racism. And consider the costs of not acting on principles of anti-racism when faced with some of these barriers, or the people that are faced with some of these barriers. Silence is often taken as tacit support for racist outcomes. So strong emotional responses can be rooted in the ideological belief that the racist is a distinct type of person who's incapable of change. But this idea really individualizes racism. It makes racism an individual issue that requires individual action. But as I mentioned, racism really is a part of social and political structures. And we all actively or passively participate because it is a structural issue. Even if we put effort into recognizing and unlearning racism, we will likely find ourselves being racist at some point in some way. And what's important is how allies or people who are called in process this knowledge and how they engage with people when they have told us that we've done something racist. So it's important to note here that racism and anti-racism are socially and contextually produced. They shift and they adapt to new challenges, and they do not look the same everywhere. So it's important that when engaging in community participation, allies look to community leaders, look to people who are doing this work in order to be the most effective allies that they can. Racist behaviors are not always inherent personal failings because they are structural outcomes. And when we individualize racism, it kind of allows people to shield themselves from their participation or their roles in society. If we conceptualize racists as bad people, we tend not to want to think of ourselves and the people we care about as bad people. So it might also be easy to say that ourselves and the people that we know or people that we care about aren't racist if we conflate those two things, if we conflate being a bad person and being racist. So we need to conceptualize racism as socially produced rather than as individual failings in order to commit to anti-racism. And the last thing I want to mention here about barriers is self-transformation projects. So some scholars note that even when we are educated about anti-racism, even when we are watching the news and paying attention, this kind of information can become part of self-transformation projects, where we start to form an idea of ourselves as a moral, enlightened, or educated person who acknowledges that they have been or are racist. But again, these identity goals can distract from trying to produce systemic change and engaging in what systemic change might look like. So I really like this quote here from @mraz, who says, "I want to live in a world where people who learn about harm to others care more about ending it than proving they aren't causing it." So I'm going to take a closer look at the concept of allyship. As I mentioned, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect or a bit of a gap between what scholars say an ally is and how allyship is being acted on in some instances in the social. So there are clear tensions here. For example, participants I interviewed tended, when they were concerned about allyship, tended to emphasize a form of allyship centered on not being racist rather than being anti-racist. And these gaps involved between theory and practice are a result, or partially a result, of competing ideas about what it means to be an ally. So allyship tends to position allies as support in struggles that aren't fully theirs. And sometimes this distance between the ally and the group we might think of as most affected by an issue is important. Sometimes that's desired, sometimes that distance fulfills an important function. But sometimes an ally can be more effective if they commit to solidarity. That is, if they recognize that the struggle at hand is also their struggle and act accordingly. Sometimes this is called being an accomplice or an advocate. I mainly refer to this as solidarity, particularly in this presentation. And when I say committing to solidarity, I mean viewing racism as an issue that includes white people rather than an issue that white people assist people of color with. And I do not mean that white people should view themselves as benevolent saviors, or that we should speak over people of color or speak for people. I mean that white people and people committed to solidarity should recognize that everyone's liberation is bound together. So, for example, it seems clear at this point that returning land to Indigenous peoples around the world is a meaningful step towards liberating all of us from the effects of climate change. And with this knowledge, we might look at how we can best support Indigenous sovereignty or Indigenous independence and start discussing the intersectionality of climate change with people that we know. And scholars and community organizers argue that some of the barriers to allyship that I've talked about are not only a byproduct of allyship, they're one of the features. So if we take a closer look at what the language of allyship might produce, or in particular, what that idea of distance between the ally and the issue might produce, people have argued that these conceptualizations of allyship can encourage performative engagements, profiting from allyship, using allyship as fashion, and inconsistent commitments. And some of these things can result in allies being invested in the structures that make allyship possible and necessary, rather than trying to abolish those structures. However, solidarity tends to situate people within social issues. Solidarity acknowledges that everyone is part of the social and that issues such as racism really are everyone's issue. So why commit to solidarity? We tend to focus on forms of privilege, white privilege, cisgender privilege, all kinds of privilege that we may be afforded. These are very real, but we should also discuss how racism and other forms of oppression shape and limit those we might consider part of dominant groups. So racism and white supremacy reduces capacities to work and relate across difference. They socially isolate people. Racism asks us to support structures that treat some people as inherently dangerous or less valuable than others. And it asks us to reproduce these systems. So as I mentioned, the liberation of different peoples is intersectional and bound together. That doesn't always mean that we're working towards the exact same thing, but we can still be against racism and white supremacy and everything that it asks us to do and reproduce. Solidarity helps us build our capacities for relating and working across difference. How can people commit to solidarity? This is definitely not an extensive list, but it is a start. We can go to protests to commit to solidarity. Being in the streets is incredibly important, and it's a place where we can learn a lot about what is needed and how we can contribute to anti-racism. However, you should always be mindful of your health and the health of others. Although there have been almost no cases of COVID associated with recent anti-racism protests, attending a protest does carry some risk. Those wanting to commit to solidarity can listen to people across categories of difference and believe them. And of course, when doing this, we should all be media literate and check our sources. And the work of describing oppression, its material outcomes, and what can be done to address oppression is already done in most instances. So what do I mean by that? I mean that white people don't have to ask people of color to be racism experts. This can be exhausting. It can ask one person to speak for whole groups of people with different experiences and opinions. It can be painful and traumatic. It can put someone in a position to do labor that they don't want to do. There's been so much academic and non-academic work produced over decades that anyone looking to be an ally or committing to solidarity can engage with in order to act on principles of anti-racism. People can have difficult conversations about race and racism, particularly within their own communities, having difficult conversations with themselves and people in their own communities about how we can act on principles of anti-racism. People can give material support. So give money, for example, to Indigenous legal funds or other things. Material support can be very important and it's almost always needed. Along with that, we can give time, labor, food. There's a lot of ways to find out what is needed and what's most appropriate. Katz says that white people should learn about their histories and positions in social structures that differentially empower white people. People can get involved in their communities and vote on everything you can, at the community level, at the provincial level, at the national level. If you have a chance to shape your world through the political process, I say it's a good idea to do that. And we can use our knowledge, privilege, and abilities to reproduce anti-racism, which brings me to public sociology. So when method is combined with an interest in conversing with the public, social justice, and meeting public needs, we can refer to it as public sociology. And public work is particularly important to maintaining sociology's primary concern of engaging with society and the social. And in 2005, Burway said that in times of market tyranny and state despotism, sociology, and in particular its public face, defends the interests of humanity. So I feel that public sociology is very important. And it enables us to do some things that other methods don't. So public sociology enables scholars to situate their work in relation to collaboration, to disrupt the idea of an objective truth, and to broaden the scope of methodology and communication. And I found that this was really complementary to arts-based methods, which seek to do some of the same things, seek to capture and say something that don't fit well into quantitative structures. They can help us communicate some things about our communities, material outcomes, and emotions, and all the complications therein that quantitative measures don't always or can't capture very well. So performance as public sociology. I wrote a stage production entitled We Without You that uses interview transcripts to discuss racialization in Toronto's queer politics. I will say that it was quite a bit, it was very relatable and impactful outside of queer politics as well. And I'll get to why I know that closer to the end of the presentation. But there were things that came up in interviews that I felt were really important to address outside of the structures of the academy. So many of the self-identified white people I interviewed reproduced racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, by saying things like Black Lives Matter is not a part of the community, that Black people are inherently criminal, and that the new pride flag that was developed in Philadelphia with the brown and black stripes is not about inclusion, and that people of color are causing issues by asking to be recognized, rather than the erasure of people of color being the issue itself. Someone said the N-word in an interview, a white person said the N-word in an interview, and just in case there's any question about if that's racist, it was a hard R, and he followed that up with some very inflammatory statements about the necessity of police brutality. Someone said that the Pride Parade is not a place for people of color. And I interviewed people of color who said they don't feel safe in the Gay Village area in Toronto, even though people mentioned that that was one of the safest areas, or they felt safer in the gay village area than most other areas of the city. People told me that they were refused entry into queer spaces, and people of color said that they were attacked by members of their own communities because of their race. So I had responses that reproduced racism and community exclusion, and I had responses from self-identified white people that said racism was not an issue in queer politics or in their communities. So I wrote the play to address this gap in public knowledge and show some of the scope of the issue of racism. And although many forms of racism in Toronto queer politics, I knew going into the play that this would not be news for a lot of people, the responses I had indicated that there was a large blind spot for many people, and that sharing this work in a public way might be helpful or useful or actionable at the local level. So I started working on We Without You while I was doing my fieldwork in Toronto, and it took me 18 months from when I started writing the script to the last performance in November 2018. So just to give you an idea of some of the process involved, I had to write the script, refine the script. I held a meeting for a first reading to get feedback. I refined the script again a few more times. I had to secure funding, cast people, secure a director, and recruit a crew member to run 2 slideshows, play music, and do our lighting. There was a slideshow that ran while audiences found their seats and waited for the performance, and a slideshow that ran during the performance that provided context, definitions, and levity in some places to the material. Rehearsals and other meetings with the cast took about 80 hours over 10 weeks, and I likely put in about 160 hours into writing and producing the play. It might be more than that, I didn't really keep track. So what does performance enable? Well, performance helps us meet the challenge of relying on forced disclosure. I was really inspired by work done by Sylvia and Francis about the relationships between whiteness and exploitative storytelling. So for example, Sylvia and Francis argue that storytelling spaces are linked to power relationships, and marginalized people are often asked to tell potentially distressing stories about their experiences of oppression and discrimination, with the expectation that sharing these narratives will produce more equitable conditions. However, lasting social and institutional changes rarely occur as a result of storytelling workshops, which reproduces marginalization. So I really wanted to do something that protected people's identities and also kind of removed the stories and context of the play from that personal disclosure element. So I didn't want to do a workshop or a focus group or anything like that where people had to talk to each other and disclose potentially painful things. So I took participant responses and made them into composite characters, which again, it protects people's identities and helped me avoid reproducing marginalization. And actors were not asked to interact with audiences, so I didn't have a Q&A after performances. I didn't want actors to have to be answerable to audiences' potentially upset reactions or their emotions. I just kind of wanted to create a space where people had to sit and process information without responding in the moment. So I felt that performance was a great method for distributing sensitive information in a way that directed people to focus less on their emotions and more at the subjects at hand. Writing a script for knowledge mobilization and community engagement allowed me to analyze my data in innovative ways. So instead of only coding for commonalities and links to theory, I was able to code for the conversations I wanted to have and the conversations that I felt were important. So I was able to situate responses and stories in conversations with each other and in connection with each other. The participants in my study will likely never meet, and if they did, it's even less likely that they would discuss anti-racism. Writing and producing We Without You also gave me space to process my own emotions about current events, fieldwork, racism, anti-racism. By writing myself into the script, I made myself a character in the play. I was able to give voice to my own anger, grief, frustration, confusion, and joy, but in conversation with other characters. So it wasn't completely focused on myself and my emotions, but it was part of a larger conversation that people were having or that people wanted to have. And I didn't have a place to put any of that in my academic writing. I was able to tell stories from participants in the play that, again, could not be part of other academic writing because those stories weren't connected to enough data points. They didn't let me make a definitive or generalizable statement. I couldn't find a place for them. So for example, a participant shared with me how they contracted HIV after being socially ostracized for not being interested in sexual activity. They said they gained more social acceptance for not wanting sexual intercourse after they contracted HIV. And in the play, this story was supported with information about PrEP and managing HIV as a chronic illness. And if I was doing it now, I would include that anyone with an undetectable viral load cannot pass HIV to intimate partners. But I didn't write about that in any of my academic writing. And even if I did find a way to discuss it in an article, it would not communicate the same things or have the same impact as it did on stage. I was also able to partner with community organizations, even though all performances of We Without You were free to access and they were held in accessible venues. I collected donations for HIV/AIDS regional services. I promoted the Levana Gender Advocacy Center, as well as Ontario Public Interest Research Group at the Kingston performances. I did try to promote groups that were relevant to the space of each performance. So this is the poster that was used for promoting We Without You and advertising and pretty much everything. It was created by Mark Lazaro, and you can see there that I got funding from a number of places, which enabled me to materially support community artists and emerging scholars and small arts-based venues and graduate students. Having that funding was incredibly meaningful, and it all went to either creating the performances or helping other people in the community. These are photos from performances. On the left is from our Toronto performance. We performed at the 519. That is a picture of the cast. I want to draw your attention to Kemi King, who was not only a cast member, but also our director. The photo on the right is from our Kingston performance, where we filled our venue, the Baby Grand Theatre, to capacity when we performed for 78 people. Rehearsals created space for myself and the cast to discuss dramaturgy, public sociology, theory, anti-racism. It wasn't just the moments that everyone saw of performances, it was everything leading up to those sensationalized moments. So the rehearsal processes, writing the script, everything really went into creating space to share and process knowledge. And it was incredibly meaningful for all of us. But it wasn't just that I enjoyed working with everyone that I worked with, because of course I did. There was important interdepartmental and cross-disciplinary education going on, which I would argue really helped our development as scholars and also community engaged people. And I think it's really important for institutions to support that as well. So performance as community engagement. I didn't only write and produce a play because I wanted to, or because I thought it was good for my project. I wrote the play in response to the things people told me in interviews. When we talked about anti-racism strategies and trying to bring people together and inform people, participants either outright told me that the arts were very important or kind of alluded to wanting space to have conversations without, while still being protected, or space to process without having to feel shame or potentially have people get very upset at them in a way that kind of stopped the conversation. All participants chose their own pseudonyms, and I changed a few demographic details in order to protect people's identities. So when I asked Zane, a Middle Eastern Canadian gay man, about what he'd like to see happen in relation to racism in the gay community or in gay circles, he talked extensively about how he felt people in Canada were very concerned with political correctness, and sometimes that tended to stop conversations or prevent conversations. He said, I would feel ashamed to speak about it more publicly because racism is shamed here, and I feel like we all have some sort of inadvertent racism. And I think he's really right. I think that those conversations are really important to taking inventory of ourselves and the things that we might reproduce sometimes even without even knowing it. So in relation to Zane's response, I felt that it was important, or I felt the play was important because, again, people didn't have to disclose. It was just space to process and think about things. Alex, a community organizer, observed that the arts were being used effectively to facilitate communication and support, even when other programming wasn't available. Alex said that people, particularly Indigenous people and people of color, felt very empowered in art spaces. Sunshine said that music and art are great places to be doing any kind of activism, that it helps us inform and educate the youth and get youth involved in doing activism. And Sunshine said that they would have they'd like to see arts and music being embraced in order to facilitate expression and promote positive ideas. So I mentioned that the play was meaningful, impactful, and relatable across multiple categories of difference. I know that because I have data about it. I use performances to generate data by giving audience members comment cards, and over 75% of audience members shared their comments on the performances. And this is a really high response rate. If you do surveys or other kind of quantitative work, or even if you're doing interviews, 75% is an incredible response rate. I was very, very happy with that. And the comments were overwhelmingly positive. People said that they were extremely moved. Many people commented on how important they felt it was to bridge academic work and public work. Someone said, it's nice to know I'm not alone. Someone said, every person in the audience can personally relate to it. And people came up to me in person as well for weeks after the performance to tell me about their emotional responses and how they cried, or how the play made an impact on how they saw themselves and others. So the play really did everything I wanted it to, and even more than that. There were unexpected social effects that were really great. I thought that the play was really impactful, and I think that it showed the importance of public sociology and what can be done with it, and showed that we need more public sociology. So I would highly recommend anyone thinking about doing any kind of public sociology project to do it. It does open us up to publics. It does open us up to collaboration and feedback, and it's all meaningful and important processes. So thank you very much. If anyone, I'm happy to take a few questions and have a conversation, but if anyone wants to email me, please feel free to do that. I understand that this is being recorded, so I want to make sure that my references get on the video. If anyone wants to read anything that informed my talk or informs my work, these are all pretty great. So I just want to make sure they're up there so that if anyone wants to look them up, they can. Okay, Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grills. That was fantastic, and I think very thought-provoking for many of us dealing with these issues. So we can turn it over to a Q&A. If you do have a question, best thing to do is to type in your question in the chat function of Zoom, and Sylvia can follow along and I can read things out and we can keep our questions in order. Otherwise, it's difficult to know the proper order if it's on Zoom and I have bobbing heads.
I'm having some difficulty bringing up the chat, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see the chat there.
Okay.
I can bring it back up if we need to. Okay, I can see it now.
Question from Nadia, is it possible to circulate these references for those who attended this talk?
Yeah, I mean, we can distribute via email. I can send a copy of my slides to the center. They're also on the video, which I understand can be looked up on YouTube. So they'll be available that way too. Okay.
Oh, sorry. So I have a question around how long we have. We have until 1:30 for Q&A. So we have a lot of time for some good discussion. Okay. From Allison, we have a question. I think these are private. I don't know if
yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the
I don't know if guests are allowed to. Yeah, I think that they are not permitted to send to everyone. So Sylvia, I'll read out the questions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Okay, from Allison, I'm wondering about the tension between solidarity and actively participating in allyship versus listening, honoring, self-determination / taking direction from Indigenous activists. I'm thinking specifically about what's happening at 1492 Land Back Lane.
Okay, so tension between solidarity and taking direction from Indigenous activists? I don't think there necessarily has to be tension there. I think that solidarity does involve taking direction from people already doing the work and people that are involved in their communities. I think that solidarity, or very much a part of solidarity, is listening to Indigenous activists and taking direction and doing what's needed. Does that answer your question?
Okay, we're going to go on to Eric.
Okay, so I couldn't figure out how to actually write out my question, so I'm just going to try and speak it. And basically, I'm just wondering whether you could, so you could talk a little bit more about the interview portion of your work, because I'm interested to know a little bit more about how that was done, how you decided who to speak with, and how you produced the conversations that could get at some of these issues. Because you spoke initially about how when confronted with our racism, white folks often take this sort of like individualizing kind of approach to racism where, you know, the whole way of thinking about it is, you know, there are these bad folks and I'm not one of those bad folks, so I'm not, you know, my sort of allyship is to assert that I'm not a racist, but I don't really engage in, but the folks didn't really engage in active solidarity work that's committed to anti-racism. Can you talk a little bit about how did the interviews express that type of perspective? Because the interviews the snippets that you showed were about sort of pretty direct racist sort of comments and behavior. So like, where did you get that other understanding from? And was it reflected in the interviews that you conducted? And who did you conduct the interviews with so that that would make visible those views? Like, did you try to select people who you were imagined as white queer folks who were allies to people of color who are involved in queer politics? I'm not sure I've got that straight figured out in my head. Sorry, that's long and convoluted, but hopefully that gives you something to work with.
It's a great question about methods. So I advertised all over Toronto. I don't know if I mentioned I had participants from as far away from Richmond as Richmond Hill. And I didn't turn anyone away. So I didn't select people from a pool. I interviewed everyone who wanted to be interviewed as long as they were over or 18 or over. I went into the project kind of wanting to talk to people who identified as sexually fluid, as bi or pan or something like that. I'm a queer person myself, and I was interested in structures of bi-erasure and how biphobia and things like that kind of fit into the community. But I had a lot of monosexual people who wanted to talk to me. So I just ended up getting as much data as I could. So, and in relation to producing conversations or how the interview becomes a curated space where people kind of, they tell you what you want. You don't know what's going on in someone's head. So those allyship comments, those kind of, they weren't overtly racist, but they were also kind of hesitant, came mostly from self-identified people who used allyship language, but weren't sure about how to go about it. And I felt like my whiteness opened up space for them to talk to me about tensions. And like I think that our embodiment acts in the interview space. So that had an effect on what people told me. So people ended up told me about how they felt like they couldn't say things, or they felt upset, or they felt like it was really important. It's not that they don't see what's going on in the world. They're just not sure what to do with that information. And over the course of some of those interviews, people talked about, okay, maybe after this, I will look up what Black Lives Matter is saying. I will look up the larger context of what is going on. And I don't have any contact with people after the fact, but I think that's kind of how I got that information. And that might be part of why white people also signed up, because I think from my name, maybe they might assume whiteness, but I didn't turn anyone away for an interview. Is that kind of?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you. Okay, next question is from Kelly. Thanks for a great research and talk. Very much like the way allyship and solidarity were conceptualized. I wondered whether any participants discussed forms of privilege other than white privilege.
Sorry, participants did, or?
Yes, participants.
Participants discussed, a few different kinds of privilege, cisgender privilege. Because my interviews were in the context of speaking with queer people, they talked about a lot of queer forms of privilege or disadvantage. So it wasn't only white privilege that came up, for sure. People did recognize and engage with other forms of privilege.
Okay. From Maria, how can one be an ally from within when working for institutions and systems that have been deemed oppressive?
That's really good. I think that can be difficult. I think sometimes allyship work can be stifled by institutions. And I think in some ways, the answer is to keep working. I think in some ways to find structures outside those institutions is part of the answer too. To find ways to do the work and try not to get caught up in being invested in the structures that produce the need for allyship, right? Because that's the goal, or at least the goal for many people, and I think certainly my goal, is to not have these structures, to not have these structures that reproduce racism and colonial ideas. So even though it can be really challenging, I think consistent work and consistent effort and it can be really needed in these institutions that are reluctant to change. So I hope that helps, and I hope you're not too discouraged. from doing that work, because it is really important, particularly in the face of resistance.
Okay, thank you. Leslie had to run, but she'll watch the video for the answer. Can you say something about the conditions for sustained solidarity? Also, she's curious about your sense of the role of white anti-racist groups like SURJ showing up for racial justice.
Okay, so first I'll talk about sustained solidarity, because that can be difficult. Community organizers in my project talked about burnout and how burnout is a very real issue, and we do need to take care of ourselves, and we do need to take time to do that. Otherwise, we won't be able to engage in doing solidarity anymore, right? We do need to be mindful of our own health and our own barriers and our own limits, and that's okay. As for Surge showing up for racial justice, I'm not entirely aware of their actions or their leanings. By their name, they sound like they're doing some great work. I know that there are some amazing organizations out there doing good work that have white people involved in them, but not all the time, right? I think sometimes, as mentioned with some of the tensions with allyship and some of the barriers and some of the issues that scholars and community organizers have pointed out, sometimes some forms of allyship are less helpful than they could be. So I think, doing that background work of an organization you want to be involved in, or an organization that is doing work, is really, really important. Check out if they have political or corporate ties, check out what their leanings are, check out who they're listening to. Those things are all really important. But I do think it is important for white people to talk to other white people. It is important for white people to be engaged in their communities and talking to other white people in order to encourage solidarity.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Eric. Do you feel there is a role for the concept of allyship in doing anti-racist/queer politics, or do you feel it is too limiting, requiring replacement by notions of solidarity? It's easy for people to say, I'm an ally. What is a parallel way of naming oneself within a politics of solidarity that goes beyond the idea of being an ally?
So about the idea of there being some things about the concept of allyship that we want to keep, that we want to retain. Sometimes it can be really valuable. It's language that I think people really understand, but at least at this point in time, I think that there's a really low barrier to claiming oneself as an ally. And that's not always appropriate, and that can really reproduce harm. And I've talked with people who said that sometimes that's a signal that it's going to take a bit more work to trust this person, because it's not entirely clear what some people say when they say ally. As for naming ourselves other than ally, naming ourselves in the context of solidarity, I am not sure what that looks like. I don't tend to name myself. I tend to say things like give the land back, and kind of have that speak for itself.
Okay, from Nadia, as a white researcher, how have you confronted ideas about white-centered thinking in your own work? I'm curious to hear about your own journey, and especially about how writing a PhD on this topic can be managed as a white person.
Yeah, for sure. There is a lot of personal stuff to deal with, and that we continue to deal with. Likely in any area that you want to become an expert in. But learning, I did a similar thing in my master's degree too, where I interviewed people who identified as Indigenous and queer and their access to healthcare. So I had some background in doing this, and I had some knowledge about how colonialism has shaped our gender and sexuality and our ideas about that in Canada. So, I mean, keep working at it, keep reading. It's gonna, for me, it was definitely uncomfortable at times, continues to be uncomfortable at times, right? And something that people said too, or that, you know, they were concerned about getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing. And I think that what we do with that, when we find it in ourselves or when someone calls us in, what we do with that is really, really important in order to engage in sustained solidarity and do that. And certainly I've had moments, I expect to continue to have moments where I learn. Just because I have a PhD doesn't mean I stop learning, doesn't mean I stop caring about the things that I care about, doesn't mean that there's not more to learn, right? Because racism and other oppressive structures get reproduced in according with current context, right? This is something to be aware of, so that adapting and how different communities deal with it in your local context or the context you're involved with is always something to learn, is always something to learn more about. And of course, taking direction from people who have been there, taking direction from people who are doing the work is helpful as well.
Thank you. From Laura, what advice would you give to ensure we are appropriately reflective in this work without over-focusing on self-transformation?
So I think it's, you know, pretty important to know that even though our self stories can be really important and they can empower others to do similar kinds of actions, it's not really about us as individuals. These structures, police brutality has been around for so long. It's not really about any individual person, right? It's a structure that produces violence. It's a structure that produces disempowerment, differential access. So kind of remembering that and remembering not to center ourselves will likely lead to being appropriately reflective, right? So try not to take up, you know, space that isn't for you and stuff. And part of that is just learning and listening, knowing when to do that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, we're waiting for more questions. Can I ask one?
Please, yeah.
While we wait for people to write out and think out their questions. So sort of something that I grapple with is around, you know, viewing and acknowledging and being aware of racism as a systemic structural issue, and taking away that individual kind of blame and taking it away from it being an individual issue. And yet our strategies and our kind of solutions lie in individual responsibility. So we have to speak up, we have to challenge, we have to resist, we have to, you know, face the structures that and the systemic issues that face us every day. So how do we sort of promote that as individual responsibility when, you know, we're framing it also as this kind of structural pervasiveness that's, you know, so yeah, that's something that I struggle with a little bit. And how do we take individual responsibility when we recognize that it's much bigger than us and it's pervasive and systemic?
Absolutely. So there is a tension there between individual responsibility and knowing that these are also larger structures, because even though they are larger structures, it also is individual action that creates change, right? And it's people coming together in communities and forming groups to meet people's needs, to address people's needs, to have important conversations, which are groups of people. So, so part of that tension might be resolved by seeking out groups that share similar interests and similar ideas and want to do similar things. But also, I talked a lot about these things being structural, but it's also important to be accountable, to not just let people go with bad faith arguments or let people go when they have knowledge and they aren't using it to shape themselves or to shape what they do. And as individuals, we do have a relationship to those larger structures. We can vote, we can engage in our communities So even though there is tension between individual responsibility and larger structures, because they are connected, and the things that we do as individuals, if that's like leveraging our individual privilege to have talks or do public sociology or do these things, being accountable and taking our positions as individuals seriously and reproducing anti-racism where we can, has an impact on those structures. So it is important to remember the relationship between those things and incorporate that into what we're doing.
Great, thanks. As we wait, I'm going to ask one more question. So you have as a public sociologist, there are a number of options that you have in terms of communicating your work, and you chose sort of this performance, this route of performance. What other ways have you considered? And yeah, what other ways have you considered sharing kind of this knowledge and work that you've obtained?
So when I was writing We Without You, I considered a few different ways of going about a public sociology project, and such as painting or some other form of performance art, or some other form of lecture or talk, like maybe at the 519. I saw Jack Halberstam speak there. It was awesome. But I considered a few different things, but in the end, performance seemed most appropriate, but also most relatable to me. I do have some background in community theater, which doesn't mean that much, really. I needed to collaborate with people who were more situated in the art world, and those collaborations were important, and collaboration, I would argue, is a really important part of doing public sociology. So I considered a few other things, but performance for me fit well with the theory and fit well with my personal background of thinking that theater and movies and television shows, that all these media forms are really great ways to tell stories, and to kind of transform the world or engage in a transformative space that holds incredible potential. And I really wanted to create that with the project. And I'm considering doing more in the future. Right now, I am currently co-authoring another script about colonialism and land use and food production, which kind of centers some of the land use practices that in particular white people engage in, and what that means and how that produces some interesting colonial ideas, and what we can do with that, and putting that on stage and making those ideas accessible. So again, bridging what I've learned in academic contexts in an accessible way that I think, again, that movies, TV, theater, these act in particular ways, and they create space for people to do that, to engage in conversation. And so I did consider other things, but there wasn't much of a question for me that writing a play would be the right thing to do for my project.
Okay, great. Others? Okay, I'm going to jump in another question. Sorry. Please jump in the chat with your questions. I'm going to ask one more and then I'll stop. So research, in terms of our interactions with the participants, is a form of intervention, right? We're bringing up topics and raising issues that perhaps our participants have not given a lot of thought to, or or make them think in perhaps different ways once they've participated in our study. Did you find any evidence of any kind of transformation in your participants, as you were doing your study, your intervention?
Interviews typically took about an hour. I don't know that. I think there were some changes in responses as the interview went on. In particular, a couple interviews where I could almost see that people were hearing what they were saying out loud, and then realizing that maybe they didn't want to say those things anymore. Like when people said, you know, I care about Black Lives Matter, but I don't know why they're upset. You could almost see people being like, I don't think I want to tell another person that after this conversation. Someone said, you know, the new pride flag with the brown and black stripes is fine, but I don't want to use it. I think it sends a weird signal. And this person identified as an ally. And you could almost see that maybe, you know, they were reconsidering it, but because there wasn't a follow-up interview, I don't know for sure how far that went, or even if what I thought I saw was accurate. Certainly some of the overt racist responses, like when I was asked, someone asked me if I thought that Black people should be so upset for things that happened so long ago. And so I said, and it's difficult to do this in an interview. It was certainly difficult for me at the time, but you know, he asked me a question. So I said, I think that it's upsetting that these things have continued on for so long, and that there's a direct relationship to that history and precarious housing and precarious employment. And so trying to explain and have an educational moment in the context of the interview. And that was an instance where I don't feel like I changed his mind at all. I didn't see any kind of recognition or change in response after I said that. So I think that there is potential there. I think I saw potential with some participants and with others not. I mostly just tried to listen and ask questions. So it's also hard to assess when I've taken on that role.
Right. Okay, I just have comment from Rona. Thank you, Sylvia, for your work and for speaking into the space today. I don't see any further questions. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think we can stop here. Thank you very much, Sylvia, for this conversation today. I think it's an important one, and I'm thrilled that it was our first event at RCPS. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us and for your comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you. I had a great time. I'm so happy to be here. Hopefully this was useful and actionable for for everyone. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing your next production.
Thanks.
And if this one, Me Without You, comes back, let us know. I'd be happy to watch that too.
Yeah, I've been asked a few times about that. I mean, I would absolutely love to do that. I would need to be enabled to do that though, or enable another group of actors and performers to do that. So if that opportunity comes up, then it's available.
Okay.